Horror Part 2s can be fun. Sometimes they continue the tone of the classic original movie, and sometimes they swing for the fences and come up with something pretty original. You also sometimes have those instances where the new director screws up the direction of the franchise entirely. We'll be talking about all that stuff today as I rank 14 Horror Part 2s from worst to best. Starting us off in last place at number 14 is a sequel to one of the most iconic horror movies of all time, and also a movie that fails to pay tribute to the original, ending up with a finished product that's obscure and mostly just boring, which is going to be Exorcist 2: The Heretic, which was released 4 years after the original in 1977. In the second Exorcist, we follow Regan, who was once possessed by a demon who finds that it still lurks within her. Meanwhile, a priest investigates the death of Regan's exorcist. Sometimes Part 2s like to go from a scary movie to a funny tone in the second movie, but this movie doesn't do either. It comes across as not even attempting to be scary, just mostly weird and obscure. This movie also spends way too much time talking about a Pazuzu character that isn't interesting and definitely isn't something I care about. The main story also revolves too much around this new psychiatric technology where we're constantly having to watch this flashing synchronizer device that hypnotizes people. I understand they're trying to be innovative and use kind of cutting edge technology for the time in the story, but those scenes are just boring. I also think the movie should have been cut down by 20 minutes or so. We spend what seems like forever just watching locusts fly around with people swatting at them. It's like we get it, locusts do a lot of damage. One big highlight for me in the movie, though, was the end. There's a really good set piece at the end of the movie, which I thought was pretty damn impressive. The end also does have some tension. Not only that, but it brings back a location from the original, which was cool. It was also great seeing Regan back and getting to follow the after effects and the trauma from everything that happened in the original. But overall, the second Exorcist movie ends up just being mostly weird and confusing throughout the entire thing. It doesn't even try to be scary and is really just not a good movie. Well, hide your pets and any famous dead relatives you might have, because the movie up next at number 13 is going to be Pet Semetary 2, which was released in 1992, 3 years after the original. The plot goes down like this. A teenage boy and his father move to his recently deceased mother's hometown where they encounter the ancient Native American cemetery with the power to raise the dead. The original Pet Semetary was a movie I felt like was always on HBO at my friend's house as a kid, so I do have some nostalgia for the franchise. This movie has quite a few actors you'll recognize in it, like Edward Furlong from Terminator 2 and Clancy Brown from Shawshank Redemption. And like the original, it's a slow burn with the majority of the action and the gore coming at the very end of the movie. I think the gore at the end and the practical effects are impressive, but I wish we would have gotten more throughout the movie. Another issue I have with this movie is I feel like they broke some of the rules from the original movie, or just took some of the Pet Semetary rules and just made them confusing. There's moments where the rules about when to resurrect someone gets confusing and kind of muddy. Someone gets resurrected quickly but is basically a complete zombie, yet somebody who's been dead a long time gets resurrected but looks almost perfectly normal when they come back. Overall, though, I think this movie's pretty boring, and it doesn't really do anything particularly well. I think it spends too much time with the high school bullying stuff, and although the acting is probably one of the strongest parts of the movie, the overall story just being too dull makes this movie my second least favorite Part 2 on this list. From this point forward on the list, these are all movies that I think are a good time. The movie at number 12 comes from one of the more unique horror franchises out there, and definitely a horror franchise that, to me, encapsulates really well just that dark 80s and 90s feel, which this next movie is going to be Hellbound Hellraiser 2, which came out 1 year after the original. The plot of Hellraiser 2 goes like this. Kirsty is brought to an institution after the horrible events of the first Hellraiser movie, where the obsessive head doctor resurrects Julia and unleashes the Cenobites and their demonic underworld. What I think is interesting about this movie is that it feels like a bad dream. You know how in your nightmares, sometimes things are just so random and seem to be thrown at you with no rhyme or reason? Hellraiser 2 kind of feels like that sometimes. There's moments where just random horrifying things pop up or happen to the characters, especially in the Cenobites Labyrinth. Speaking of that, the set pieces and the effects in those particular scenes are very impressive. And really just some of the sets and the effects in this movie are some of the best that I've ever seen in any 80s horror movie. I can also see why the Hellraiser franchise has such a big following all these years later. It's a very unique franchise in the genre. It also has a bit of that A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 feel to it, where it uses sexuality in a dark way. But an issue I have with this movie, which is an issue I have with a lot of part 2s, which is it lacks a lot of that surprise you get with the original just because it's a part 2. A lot of the questions from the original have already been answered, and yes, we get Kirsty back in this movie in kind of that Laurie Strode from Halloween 2 role, where they're both stuck in a hospital. I don't hate it, and I can definitely see why Kirsty is one of the most popular final girls in the genre. She's a very likable, charismatic character. But what puts the second Hellraiser movie so far back on the list for me is that although I respect the effects and I respect the brutality of the movie, Hellraiser's just not my kind of horror franchise. But if you love it, I'm not judging you, it's just not really my thing. Up next at number 11 is one of those movies that intentionally has a very different tone than the original movie, which is going to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, which came out 12 years after the original. The story of the second Texas Chainsaw movie goes like this. A radio host named Stretch is victimized by a familiar cannibal family as a former Texas Marshal hunts them. A lot of people really love this movie, and I get why. The characters are fun, Stretch is one of the best final girls in the franchise, and it's just a lighthearted, silly movie with some decent kills. We also get Dennis Hopper in the movie, playing a former Texas Marshal who's trying to track down the mysterious people that attacked his niece Sally and brutally murdered his nephew Franklin. I think Dennis Hopper does a good job in this role and also has some funny moments that may or may not be intentional, but hilarious nonetheless. I think the end of the movie at the abandoned amusement park from hell is a good time. We also get some classic one-liners from the Slaughter family, especially from Drayton. To me, this is one of those movies you can put on and have a good time with if you're in the mood for a Texas Chainsaw movie, but you just want something that's light and kind of easy to watch. However, this isn't my favorite Leatherface in the franchise, not my least favorite, but kind of just in the middle of the pack for me. But overall, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is a fun time, but it's not a good enough movie to overtake some of my favorites in that franchise, like the original and the remake. Now moving on to number 10, which is going to be Hostel 2, which came out 1 year after the original. Hostel 2 follows American college students studying abroad. They are lured to a Slovakian hostel and then discover the grim reality behind it. I'm a big fan of the original Hostel, which I know isn't everyone's cup of tea. A lot of people just think it's made a name for itself because they see it as kind of that shock value, torture, gore. I would mostly disagree with that. But I like how in the second movie they continue the story and tone of the original, but also give us a new perspective. In the second movie, you get to follow the rich buyers this time around. You also get to see the curtain pulled back a little bit on the museum. I still prefer the mystery of the first movie, but overall, it's still pretty fun. We get some fantastic gore in this one. Like the original, this movie has a little bit of that Euro trip vibe to it where it's young kids partying and they get taken advantage of. This movie, though, does a good job of giving me that very suffocating and lonely feeling like the original did, where you're in a foreign place, you don't know the language, you don't know the nuances of the area, and when something bad happens, it definitely makes you feel homesick for the characters. And yes, the ending to Hostel 2 is nowhere near as good as the ending to the original, and how they killed off one of the most important characters in the franchise was a little bit weird, but regardless, Hostel 2, I still have a fun time with it, and that's one of the biggest reasons why it sits at number 10 for me. Up next at number 9 is coming from one of the most gory and popular horror franchises of the 2000s, which is going to be Saw 2, which was released 1 year after the original. In Saw 2, a detective and his team must rescue 8 people trapped in a factory by the twisted serial killer known as Jigsaw. I like the original Saw. It's definitely an iconic movie, and I really like the twist at the end. In Saw 2, they try to make it bigger than the original. Instead of 2 people in a bathroom for most of the movie, we now have more people trying to get out of these traps. And the traps in Saw 2 are pretty gnarly. The needle trap is a rough one. The guy with the rings hooked all over his body is pretty damn brutal. So of course, like the original, you're going to get plenty of gore here. What knocks this one down a little bit for me is the characters are just not as charming and just not as good as the characters in the original. Instead of the fun dynamic between Lee Wanell and Carrie Elves, we now follow Donnie Wahlberg and a bunch of just unlikable and forgettable characters. The twist at the end of Saw 2 isn't as good as the twist at the end of the original movie, but I still like it, and also Jigsaw is pretty on point in this movie. At number 8, we've got the first sequel to one of the big 3 horror franchises, which is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, which was released 1 year after the original. In Nightmare 2, a teenage boy is haunted in his dreams by deceased child murderer Freddy Krueger, who is out to possess him in order to continue his reign of terror in the real world. The second Elm Street movie is one of those sequels that really tried to do its own thing. They didn't even ask Nancy to return, and really only 2 things that come back from the original are the house and Freddy. One thing that hurts this movie to me, and definitely comes across on screen, was how rushed the script was. And I think it's far from a perfect story. New Line really didn't make that much money from the original movie because they pretty much had mortgaged everything just to get the movie made, so they wanted to pump out the second movie as fast as possible to finally get some money rolling in. I really like Freddy in this one though. Next to the original, this is one of the scariest Freddys in the franchise. I really like the hook-nosed witch look that they went for Freddy. This movie gets a lot of flack for showing Freddy outside of the dream world a lot, but I personally don't hate it. I think the pool scenes are fun, it gives us some more kills, and some iconic Freddy lines. We get some great effects in this movie too, like that incredible shot of Freddy coming out of Jesse. Easily one of my favorite moments in the franchise. I also really like the characters in this movie. There's also something to be said about the underlying sexuality in the movie. Mark Patton becomes one of the first male scream queens in the genre, which will always make this movie unique. There's a lot to like about Freddy's Revenge, and it's definitely one of my favorite Elm Street movies in the franchise. All right, at number 7 is probably a movie some of you out there are gonna be like, you have this movie above A Nightmare on Elm Street 2? What are you doing? But this is my list, and these are movies that I personally enjoy the most. So up next on the list is going to be I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, which came out 1 year after the original. The murderous fisherman with a hook is back to once again stalk the 2 surviving teens, Julie and Ray, who had left him for dead, as well as cause even more murder and mayhem, this time at a posh island resort. The real plot of this movie, though, is Jennifer Love Hewitt in a tight tank top and baggy pants with Captain Hook running around slashing people. But this movie's fun. I'm definitely a sucker for most of the movies inspired by Scream, especially the ones written by Kevin Williamson. Maybe it's my age, but I think they're just a damn good time. What's fun about this movie is we get a really fun setting that I think is really unique for a slasher movie. Really, one of my favorite settings for any slasher movie. Jennifer Love's character and Brandy basically win a trip to the Bahamas, but little do they know it's the off season, so this big resort is completely empty, and they find themselves stuck in a massive storm alone on a remote island with the killer on the loose. This movie also has one of the earlier appearances by Jack Black. He plays this like resort weed guy. Every resort needs a weed guy, right? I didn't like the whole Julie and Will thing. That kind of started to grate on me after a little while, but maybe it just felt weird because the actors are 10 years apart in age in real life, but are supposed to be in college together. Yes, this movie takes that 90s and 2000s trope by putting a rapper or a singer in the cast. We've got Brandy here playing Julie's roommate, which I'm fine with. Brandy kicks some ass in the movie. The kills in this one, though, are really fun. It's tense. I love the feel of the movie in the second half with the rain. We also get a fun little graveyard sequence towards the end. Overall, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer is just a really good time, and I think it's one of the best movies inspired by Scream. Slashers are also my favorite subgenre, so that's another reason why this movie gets ranked so high for me. At number 6 is going to be Final Destination 2, which was released 3 years after the first movie. I'm just unapologetically a big fan of the Final Destination movies. Yes, it's silly and ridiculous, but overall, I just have a really good time with these movies. In the second Final Destination, Death is stalking Kimberly Corman and multiple survivors of a deadly highway accident. We've got a lot to talk about in this movie, but I'll try to keep it pretty short. When a movie's able to make you never forget something, there's something to be said about that. How could I not have this movie as one of the better part 2s when there's so many memorable things in this movie? Obviously, the logging scene is one of those things. I know it's been talked about ad nauseum, but when's the last time you saw a logging truck on the highway and didn't immediately speed around it? We all know we do that every single time, but just that entire opening scene, in my opinion, is pretty damn iconic. This movie ages pretty well to me. The gore still looks pretty good, But what's great about Final Destination 2 is it doesn't try to be something that it's not. It leans into what it needs to lean into, which are the kills and how unique the kills are. Obviously, the acting in this movie isn't great, but you don't go to a Final Destination movie for the acting. I love that part in the movie how they all decide to meet at the cop's apartment, which is this industrial, modern-looking apartment with basically just death traps everywhere. Like the guy's got a kayak hanging from his ceiling, but it's just fun. And yeah, it's one of those things that make you say, come on. But you know, it's just gonna lead to pure bloodiness and goodness. I mean, the very end of the movie at the barbecue, you know you laughed. It gets me every time. But Final Destination 2, I guess you could say it's a guilty pleasure for me. It's just a movie that I enjoy and I can rewatch. This isn't a list of what movies I think are technically made the best. These are just the movies that I enjoy the most, and I think Final Destination 2 is a pretty damn good time. And starting us off in the top 5 is going to be the sequel to our favorite scary doll movie, which is going to be Child's Play 2, which came out 2 years after the original Child's Play. The plot of the second movie goes like this. While Andy's mother is admitted to a psychiatric hospital, the young boy is placed in foster care, and Chucky, determined to claim Andy's soul, is not far behind. And the reason why I don't have this movie in my top 3 is because I don't really enjoy the first half of the movie. Yes, there's some great Chucky moments in the first half of the movie, but I don't love having to watch Andy get picked on and all this shitty stuff happen to such a seemingly good kid. It just kind of hurts to watch. You feel so bad for the kid. Which, yes, you could argue means it's written and directed well, but it's just uncomfortable for me. I hate watching this kid struggle so much, a kid who's been through so much that you just want to see finally get a W. But Chucky in this movie is charismatic, witty, and evil like usual. His one-liners are amazing in this movie. The gore is also great in this movie. The teacher kill, the eyeball kill, both really damn good. I mean, come on, the entire set piece at the end in the factory is also really impressive and just a very smart way to bring the movie full circle, ending it where it all began. As far as the characters go, I really like Kyle's character. She's definitely someone you root for. This kid who's been through all these foster homes but still seems like a good kid. Andy's also great once again in this movie. But outside of those two and Chucky, most of the other characters are very forgettable. I know some people would probably have this as their number 1 part 2 in the genre, or at least top 3 at the very least. But to me, like I mentioned, that whole first half of the movie is just something that I just don't really enjoy watching. Up next at the number 4 spot is Scream 2, which came out 1 year after the first Scream. Scream 2 takes place 2 years after the first series of murders as Sydney acclimates to college life. Then, someone donning the Ghostface costume begins a new string of killings. Like I said earlier, I'm a big Scream fan. I personally really like what Scream's done for the genre. Scream 2 definitely does a great job continuing the tone of the original. What's great about Scream 2 as well, that not a lot of other sequels can say, is that the director from the original, Wes Craven, returned once again, which gives you some continuity there. But I'm just a sucker for this era of horror. I like the new setting in college this time, which is fun. I like how this movie shows the growth of Sydney. She's even more of a badass than she was in the original movie. She's almost 2 steps ahead of Ghostface at certain points in the movie. But I just like when sequels show legacy characters kind of grow and progress, especially the final girl. Scream's also known for adding well-known actors to the cast, and out of the sequels, this movie does that the best. We get Sarah Michelle Gellar, Jerry O'Connell, Joshua Jackson for a second, and Timothy Olyphant is great here in the movie as well. Scream 2, though, doesn't have my favorite Scream opening scene, but it is fun. Not the worst opening in the franchise to me. I also think it's a great reveal at the end with a little bit of a Pamela Voorhees vibe thrown in, which is great. Scream 2, though, overall does a great job continuing what the original did well. The kills are fun, there's some tense moments, and I think it's got a great reveal at the end. All right, now we're into the top 3, and sometimes I would say that these 3 movies are a little bit interchangeable, just kind of based off of the mood that I'm in. These last 3 are very iconic part 2s, and all of them, in my opinion, are just really damn good. At number 3 is a movie that I think is almost as good as the original, which is going to be Aliens, which came out 7 years after the first movie. The plot of Aliens goes something like this. Decades after surviving the Nostromo incident, Ellen Ripley is sent out to re-establish contact with a terraforming colony, but finds herself battling the alien queen and her offspring. Aliens is great. We've got James Cameron directing this sequel 2 years after The Terminator, a guy who's arguably one of the best directors of the modern era, at least when it comes to massive blockbusters. And that's basically what this is. The first Alien movie, directed by Ridley Scott, is one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made, and also one of my personal favorite sci-fi horror movies ever. The first movie, though, is pretty different than the second movie. The first one's dark, gritty, and scary, whereas the second movie's almost double the budget and more of a big action movie with some horror elements. This movie was also a pretty big risk for Cameron. Anytime you have to follow up a great original, that's tough to do, but he pulled it off in my opinion. I really like the banter between the Marines in this movie. It's also great that we get to continue Ripley's story, and this time around, a big part of the story is also about Ripley's sort of motherly role we follow with this girl, Newt, who they found at the colony. But in the second movie, we get more aliens, more action, and a little faster pace than the first movie, which when I'm in the mood for that kind of a thing, it's really fun. The rewatchability of this movie is also very high for me. So there you go, Aliens coming in at number 3 because it's just really damn good. At number 2 is a movie that I'll admit the premise of the movie, especially after the first movie, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I'm a big fan of the franchise. Here we've got Friday the 13th Part 2, which came out in theaters 1 year after the first movie. Friday 2 is the true debut of Jason Voorhees. In this one, we find ourselves at a summer camp next to the infamous Camp Crystal Lake. And this camp is preparing to open, but the legend of Jason is weighing heavy on the proceedings. I love Part 2. It's definitely one of my favorites in the franchise. I think the kills are fantastic. Of course, we get Mark's kill, the machete to the face, and then the fun little Jeff and Sandra shish kebab. And I love the Jason in this movie. Sackhead Jason feels as human as you'll ever see Jason in the franchise. I do love the massive, more menacing Jason that we see a little bit later on in the franchise, but there's just something pretty scary about this Jason. You can believe he's just a psychopath living in the woods out to avenge his mom's death. He's not something that feels supernatural yet. I like the characters in this movie too. To some people, they just see them as bags of meat waiting to get killed, but I think they're fun together. This movie also has my favorite final girl in the franchise, Ginny, who's not only tough, smart, and charming, but she also gets a pretty solid character arc. What's kind of funny is she also has some moments where she empathizes with Jason when she's talking to her friends at the bar. But Ginny gives us that iconic moment at the end using Jason's mom's sweater to get a shot at him, but I'll admit, kind of disappointed in Ginny that she couldn't get the final kill shot, but I think there's something to be said about this movie having the best final girl in a franchise that's probably the biggest horror franchise ever. To top it all off too, I love the Friday the 13th score. It's an all-timer for sure. I'm a huge fan of these woodsy settings for my slasher movies, and to me, Friday the 13th Part 2 is a great Part 2, even though the story doesn't really make a lot of sense after the first movie. All right, now my favorite horror Part 2 of all time is a movie that sometimes is my favorite movie in the franchise, which is Halloween 2, which came out 3 years after the legendary first movie. The plot of Halloween 2 goes like this. While Dr. Loomis hunts for Michael Myers, a traumatized Laurie is rushed to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, and the Shape is not far behind her. This movie is very much a Halloween movie, but with a slight Friday the 13th edge to it, and I love it. What I mean by that is it's much bloodier than the original and also has a few characters you could see in a Friday movie. Characters like Bud, who I think do a really good job offsetting the darkness and the gore to be kind of like the comedic relief in the movie. Plus, he helps give us one of the best kills in the franchise. I mean, the hot tub kill? Come on. Speaking of kills, we also get Michael creeping out of the shadows to give us the syringe to the nurse's temple, Michael lifting the girl up with the scalpel, just a ton of great kills throughout the movie. To me, this is also easily one of the best masks in the franchise for Michael Myers. It's one of the scariest masks in the franchise, and it's also one of the best Michael Myers in the franchise. I personally love how Dick Warlock portrayed the Shape in this movie. We also get a great character variety in this movie. These aren't just camp counselors getting slaughtered. We've got doctors, nurses, cops, regular townfolk, just a great variety. I know some people aren't fans of the brother and sister stuff, but that's never really bothered me. I have to also mention Dean Cundy, the cinematographer of this movie. The way this entire movie shot and lit is not only scary, but just gives off a vibe that I love in a Halloween movie. I mean, that shot outside of the hospital where you see Michael under the red lights? What a great moment in the movie. Halloween 2 is just one of those movies I can put on any time of year and just have a great time with it. Michael's amazing, the characters are great, the kills are incredible. This is definitely the Halloween movie I watch the most in the franchise. So there you go, Halloween 2, my favorite horror part 2. All right, everybody, that is it for me. Hope you enjoyed my ranking of horror part 2s. If one of your favorite part 2s wasn't on the list, sorry about that, but let me know down in the comments down below what horror part 2s are your favorite. Hell, just go ahead and rank them as far as you possibly want. I read every single comment and I respond to every single comment as well. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. Check out one of these videos next to me if you want more content from me right now. Make sure you subscribe. But anyways, everybody, I will see you in the next one.